Welcome to The Business of Family, the podcast where we explore the stories, challenges, and opportunities of family businesses. I'm your host, Tammy, and I'm a family business survivor and also a family business advisor. In this show, we will be talking with family business leaders and experts to bring you insights and inspiration so you too can survive your family business journey. Whether you're a founder, a successor, a professional, or just curious about family businesses, this podcast is for you. I'm so excited today to have my guest, Mehendi Kamani. Oh my gosh, I've known you for like 25 years.
Well, don't age us, Tammy.
Yeah. So Mehendi's been in the financial services industry for over 25 years, and you've worked with, financial institutions, insurance companies, and now you're the founder of Tall Oak Capital Advisory. And you mainly work with high net worth families and looking at wealth transfer and, asset management and all that stuff. And what's really important, I think, is, and I'm so happy you're here, because really the focus is about how do you start to transfer wealth in your family business, or if you've sold your business and you have this wealth, how do you even start to transfer that? So tell me a little bit about, what the process is when you're working with clients.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And, when I did co-found this business in 2011 with a partner of mine, we really did start with more of a traditional advisory business. And that traditional advisory business has really morphed into what it is today, which is working with these multi-generational families that are looking to transition wealth from one family, from one generation to the next generation of that same family. And I think one of the interesting things that changes is obviously the size of the wealth and also the definition of wealth. Mm-hmm. And so even before we start, one of the things we like to start to do with our clients is to understand, what does wealth mean to them within the context of, there's obviously financial wealth,
right? But
there's also perhaps an operating business which can be included in that wealth. Mm-hmm. And there are other things. In fact, human capital can be considered part of that wealth. And so what does that mean to consider human capital as part of your wealth? Well, your family can be part of your wealth definition as well. And not just this generation, but multi-generationally, thinking about it, where do we want this family wealth to be in 3 generations, and how do we want it to continue to evolve? So one of the interesting things is obviously starting with, what does wealth mean to a family today? Where are we today? Within that context, though, I think if you stop there, you kind of get lost in the idea of transitioning wealth without necessarily even thinking about, how do we grow wealth within the next generation? How do we maintain what we have? And so often we're looking at it as not just, what does wealth look like today, but what is the purpose of that wealth? And as you start to transition to the next generation, how do you want that wealth to be used as a family?
Right. And I think what's interesting when you're working with multi-generational families is the first generation is more the builder of that wealth, and they struggle a lot. And I don't think, from my experience anyway, they don't tend to share a lot with the family. So the family knows they have money or they have wealth. They just don't know what it's comprised of, or what to do with it, or what the purpose is, or what the future looks like from philanthropy, or, again, growth or estate planning, really.
Yeah, really good point, because that first gen that's created the wealth is often, when we think of the purpose of wealth for them and their version of their history, that has even evolved. And it started off with putting food on the table, and then making sure that we reinvest in the business, and the purpose of the wealth was to grow the wealth. And they haven't had necessarily that opportunity to really think about wealth in a broader context, and in the sense of certainly these generational wealth amounts. What does that mean for the family as you start to think about, this amount grows, and the purpose of wealth will change? And so it's normal that they haven't had that discussion, because even for them, that purpose might have changed.
So how do you start to get that out of the client? Because in a lot of cases, they probably don't even know. They do know, but that's not really, they haven't voiced it or documented it.
Yeah, again, great question. And I would say there is definitely consistency with a lot of our clients around that conversation. And it tends to be around values, We do look at things like what's the mission of the family, what are the, how do you bring these key value composites for not just generation one, but when you start to think of generation two and generation three, what are some of those key values that you really want to transition from one generation to the next? And so I often find that when we're talking about wealth, a lot of it comes back to, the old sort of, one of the key, good examples that I get a lot is a family comes to me and says, we want to make sure that our kids have good values and that our grandkids have good values. And so we start with that. What does that mean? Mm-hmm. And wealth is a way to, wealth is a vehicle, it's a tool. And that tool is to help to have some of these conversations and make sure that those values are transferred from one generation to the next. Mm-hmm. But to start with that question, like what is the mission of the family? What are the values that are important to you? We often do that from a business standpoint, right? It's very, very clear. We have a vision for our business, we have a mission, we have values. Yeah. But when we start to bring that sort of same concept and structure and bring it to the family side, you start to have a better understanding of what, again, is the purpose of this money? Where do we see it really helping the family in the future? And sometimes it's not just family. Sometimes it's community and a broader understanding of the ability to take that wealth and to do good in different ways. It can also be for the operating business and making sure that we maintain employees and we maintain contracts, and so there's lots of different opportunities within that.
The mission, vision, and values is much easier defined in the business, but even I find working with first, second, and third generation families in business that a lot of times that's not even defined in the business. They know it, they just haven't defined it or shared it. But when I go back to the family, very few actually have that defined or even had that conversation or really don't know what their values are. Although they have them, they just really haven't defined them. So how do you get that out of them?
Well, and again, it depends where the family is right now, because some actually have defined those family values and have done a very good job of articulating them into a family charter, but many have not. And so if you haven't done that yet, we like to take you through an exercise of saying, okay, well, let's bring out some of those values. What's interesting is who do you involve in that?
I was going to say, so who do you bring in when you're starting to have that conversation?
Well, really, Gen 1 for sure. Oh, yeah. And, often Generation 2. And then the question is, do we bring spouses into the equation, depending on how old the Gen 2 is? And this is really a discussion that we're having all along, which is to say, what does family even mean to the family? Because the definition itself of family can be different for different people. So with Generation 2, we sometimes include spouses, sometimes we don't include spouses. If we include the grandchildren, you might want to be a little bit different in your approach if they're younger. But really to try to bring as many people that are at the table that can help to define what those values might be. But sometimes it's just Generation 1 in saying what is important to you. And when we do that, one of the questions that we always ask is not what do we want your kids to remember us by, or what do we want our grandkids to remember us by, but to go even the next generation and say, if there's one value in particular, what would be the singular top value that you as a family want to be remembered by? Because to remember 5 or 7 is very difficult. But to transition 1 would be huge.
And that's amazing. And I think, as a family business advisor yourself, specializing in wealth, we're using a lot of the same concepts. You're using it to define, the product, the solutions, the care that you're, with the family, where I'm trying to get the family to even, start to have conversations and talk about these things. And the issue becomes, who do you bring into the meetings? And it's very difficult when you're dealing with Gen 1, because they're very much grounded in it was their baby. They built it. Gen 2, I find, is a little more open to bringing in the next generation. But a lot of those values have not been defined. But that's part of the struggle. As soon as you start to have those, I find, from a family's perspective, we can start to see the future. Do you find that with the wealth side of things, that once you have that mission, vision, and value of the family, then that makes it easier to define, what wealth means to them and how do you start to transition it?
Yeah, and I'll give you a really good example of how that exact sort of iteration did happen is, we often have clients that have sold businesses, and when they sell their businesses, many entrepreneurs that own operational businesses, all of their wealth is tied to their operational business, and sometimes they're not able to pull out as much money as they'd like. They do take out a certain amount, but the big payoff happens at the sale of the business. And so all of a sudden you have somebody that maybe has some RSPs and some tax-free savings account or a little bit of savings in a holding company, but not a ton, and they sell their business for a tremendous amount of money. And overnight they become, their definition of wealth has changed overnight, certainly from a liquid financial perspective. So those individuals then might say, well, how are we going to manage this money? And it's very difficult to answer that because the way that you historically have managed their wealth would be very different than the way that you manage their wealth going forward,
right?
Simply because of the magnitude as a percentage of their assets that are now sitting in these
that are
portfolios.
liquid.
Yeah. So what we'll often do is we'll actually start again that conversation to say, well, let's validate some of those questions that we've had in the past. Are the values still the same values? What's the purpose of this money? And we do try to break up the purpose of the money into different buckets, because some of it might be, I still want to maintain a certain lifestyle. In fact, I'd like to enjoy my lifestyle a little bit better now that we have this money. But some of it might be intergenerational or multi-generational. Others might be to provide funds for community. So as we start to look through what the purpose of different buckets of money might be used for, we then can start to say, well, this portion of the portfolio might be managed this way. This portion of the portfolio will be managed differently. This portion, we're really going to think of it as multi-generational. We're really going to think of it in a completely different way of managing the funds in that particular capacity. But so much of that is driven, again, by this idea of why are we doing this? What's the purpose of the money? And then tying that into the value. So we'll often start, again, that conversation to revalidate all that.
Well, and I think that, because you are a family enterprise advisor, I think that sets you apart, and that the way you approach situations is the way I approach trying to get the family to even start talking about that. So it's fabulous that you have an advisor who's looking after a certain element of their wealth or their estate, is doing the same thing. So it really shows that, understanding what your values are from a family perspective that translates into the business perspective, if you still have the business, because as you say, the business might be sold, and it doesn't stop you from still having, this equity that needs to be managed, but really understands that is such a key component of any planning, regardless of the type of planning you're doing, is you have to have a vision and a mission and values. So let me ask you that. When you're working with these families, you're looking at it from many different angles. When you work, do you work collaboratively with lawyers and accountants when developing this? And do you find they come at it from a different approach than you do?
So to answer the first question, 100%, we actually think it's extremely important that we have integrated plans with your other professionals as a family. Whether that be lawyers or accountants or any other professional that you're dealing with, it is very, very important that there are plans that work together. So and when we're thinking on that multi-generational estate transfer, for example, if your tax plan and your legal plan isn't aligned, you've got a huge problem. Or if that's not aligned to the way that we're managing monies or the way that we're doing things, we got a big problem. So we do a lot of insurances for our clients as well, life insurance. And that's another one of those where we start to go down this path of why are we even doing this? Is it to save on taxes? Is it to create wealth? Is it to have the opportunity to give back to community? There's so many different applications, and for many it's yes, yes, yes. And so as we start to do that, if we were to put a plan in place that said, here's a wonderful way to save taxes intergenerationally, but it's not aligned to your tax plan, we're going to have huge problems down the road. So we absolutely will never put something in place without talking first to your accountants and making sure that they're on board with this. And of course, if you've got your legal team that then documents this and puts it in place, we want to make sure that also is reflected within that. So I think that if you don't do that in our role, we are doing no favors for our clients, and there are going to be problems down the road. But one of the huge opportunities, though, is often when I ask a client, why do you have this trust? And that's a tough one for people to answer. And they go, well, I know we did it, 15 years ago. We don't remember why we did it or what the application is. Yeah. And sometimes the opportunity then is, as we're having these conversations, is to refresh why we have this trust. Life has changed since you put that trust in place. And so the concept that was initially used to put the trust in place may or may not still be appropriate today, or the corporate structure or the overall org chart. When we look at that and we challenge it from here's what we're trying to do today, sometimes we have the opportunity just to revalidate some of those structures that were put in place or to refresh them as well, which is good housekeeping.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I say to the lawyers all the time, you should have a call up to remind people to come in and review. But I want to go back a bit to talk about, when you're dealing with first gen or the holder of the wealth right now, and we're trying to get that mission, vision, and values out of them. How much of a struggle is it to bring in the next gen? Because a lot of first gens or the wealth holders don't necessarily want to disclose what they have to the next gen or have them be part of it. It's like, this is mine, I created it, I get to determine how this will transfer, as opposed to education and understanding. So how much of a struggle is it to have them introduce the next gen?
Yeah, and every family is so unique on that. But I guess some of the observations that we've had, there are certain families that are quite open, and they want their families to know, the next gen to know. And as you stated, that's not everybody. And many actually are very close-handed on that, but they still want you to work with the next gen. And so one of the things that we've brought into our practice is a lot more financial literacy for next gen. So speaking from a context of wealth here, obviously from an operating company, if you're training the next gen, there's many different FEAs that can help on that, family enterprise advisors that can help on how to do that. But I think from a wealth standpoint, what we do particularly, I would say in a particularly progressive way, is we really want to work with next gen on family literature or literacy. And making sure that they understand within the nucleus of their family. So let's say we're talking about Gen 2 here. Within the nucleus of their family, what does financial literacy mean for them? And so we use an expression often, we want to meet you where you're at. And so Gen 1 may be in a completely different place than Gen 2. We work with Gen 2 to fully understand financial literacy as it applies to them. As we do that, we may also bridge some of those concepts to Gen 1. In other words, often what happens is, I'm a beneficiary of the trust, but I don't know why. Well, what a great opportunity to sort of bridge within the concept of what Gen 1 wants to transfer in terms of knowledge down to Gen 2 to start to have those open conversations. But it's fun because you even get to do it with the younger generation. So you have a 16-year-old grandchild, and Gen 1 says, I want you to work with the grandchildren. And so you get the opportunity to start to talk about, in a couple of years, you can do a tax-free savings account. And do you know what that means? Or you want to open a Visa card, and what does that look like? Or how does debt work? How do taxes work? So within each generation, we're working with them on financial literacy, where they're at within their respective areas. And in a way, what we're doing is preparing the next gen for receiving that wealth. And so that, I think that's as important as working with Gen 1 on how do you transition it, is how do you help Gen 2 and Gen 3 to receive some of that.
And that's very different from the way most wealth advisors sort of manage the clients and their wealth. And that's what I do a lot, is bring the family together. Because again, we're not talking about a specific thing. We're talking about in general, so again, education. We brought in accountants to talk about, what dividends are and how to read a financial statement just from the business standpoint. And again, there's the family element, and there's, again, many more financial areas that could be improved upon, because we're not all, financially literate. We might have interests in different areas. So, that's not one of our specialties. And what I think is really important is the education piece to families, which does translate into the business, which goes into ownership as well. And I know you're very familiar with the 3-circle model, and it's very important to understand when you do something in one circle, how it impacts the other. So if you do something in the family circle, it will impact potentially ownership of an asset that you might have, or a business and operating company, or trusts, or holding companies, impacts the business, like it's all a bit of a mishmash, right? So I think education is fabulous, and I love the fact that you're doing this for families from a different angle, because that's what I do as a family business advisor who works on the family itself and not managing anything or looking after any component, but is to get them talking. And I love the fact that you're doing this. So how do you actually set yourself apart then? Like, how do you let people know that you're so different than normal wealth advisors?
Well, I think often it's because we have been doing this with families, and these family that are business owners that have transitioned their practice, their businesses, and or have transitioned it to the next gen, have often had the opportunity to work with us. And so I think there's a bit of word of mouth and recognition. But the biggest one for us is aligning wealth to, sort of bringing this conversation full circle. It's this, the concept of bringing wealth back to purpose, to having an understanding of what does that mean on a generational level? How do you tie it into values? But, you talk about the three-circle model. And for us, when we look at wealth, we look at it not as a standalone. We look at it as it sort of permeates into the three circles. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And there's different ways, again, of looking at consistency across the three-circle model. But if you think about values, if you think about the vision, the mission of the family, and again, that you have that on the family side, you also have it on the operating business. You do also have it on the ownership side. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so one of the things that differentiates us is understanding those three circles and saying, how do we integrate, as opposed to have a standalone wealth conversation that's not at all integrated into the rest? And so that ability to integrate our discussion into the broader perspective of what's real for family enterprise clients, I think is really how we differentiate ourselves. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think that's great. One of the things that you have not mentioned in this podcast is rate of return, which I think is so important, because it's not always about the rate of return. It's about what is the family trying to achieve? And there's, as you mentioned, different rates of return for different aspects of the portfolio. And I love that. But Mehendi, we have families who listen to this podcast are all over North America. So what are some of the, questions that maybe they should be asking their advisors, or when they're interviewing that they should be asking, so that they're setting themselves up for, success, for transitioning the wealth, engaging the next generation? What are some of the questions that they should ask their advisors?
Well, I think for one of the questions we love to be asked is, what are your designations? And I think obviously as a family enterprise advisor, we're both family enterprise advisors, and we do hold that designation high in terms of how we're operating our businesses and mm-hmm. the information and learning that we've had. So I think one would be, what are the designations that you have? Who do you work with? How do you work with the next gen? I do think that's really important. We talked about preparing next gen. I think working with current owners, a lot of people want to work with current owners because they have the wealth. Mm-hmm. But how do you work with next generation? And how do you prepare? What is your involvement with other professionals? So a lot of the questions that you asked today, Tammy, are really the questions that I would be asking my advisor. Mm-hmm. To your point about rate of returns, I think that is one of the most challenging questions when somebody comes to me and says, what kind of returns can you get me? And we often say, well, it really depends. What do you want?
How much risk? How much risk? What is your mission? What is your vision?
Yeah, and it's kind of funny because you have a lot of business owners that tend to have, a certain amount of wealth that they've accumulated, and they'll come to us and say, well, what kind of returns can you get? And if I said 5%, they'd say, well, I can get 25% IRRs in my business. Why would I give you that mm-hmm, money? Mm-hmm. So again, the question then is, if you can get a 7% or an 8%, is that good enough? Well, maybe not if I can still get 25. But really, it's about that diversification risk and making sure that mm-hmm. you can have assets that are being managed outside of the business, so that not all your eggs are in one basket. So that idea of diversification, and it's a really important one, and it is something we spend a lot of time with in our business, is understanding that diversification. We're not talking about, do you own, healthcare stocks and technology stocks and resource stocks? That's diversification, absolutely. But how do we diversify your investable liquid assets with your current non-investable illiquid assets, i.e. your operating business, your real estate holdings, maybe you've got multiple businesses that you own. So if you've got all these different things within your broader wealth portfolio, and your portfolio that we're managing is just one component of that, I'm not talking about diversification simply in what we're doing. I'm looking at diversification across the gamut of everything.
And there's different risks and different rates of return in those different portfolios. And I think that's what's really important. And I love the fact that, you are a family enterprise advisor working in this stream. And I think what's important is that we understand and we look at things differently than just an advisor, because we're looking at the broader picture and how one thing impacts another. It's not all about the return. It's not all about the business. If you're a lawyer, you're asking questions that impact other areas. So you're bringing in advisors. I love the collaboration. And I consider myself the quarterback that sort of creates that bridge to these other advisors. I just have one last question before we go, because I know we're running out of time, but we were talking about, really looking at their whole structure. How many times when you review shareholder agreements from an operating company and the wills, do they ever line up?
Well, yes. Often they don't. And
Good. I'm thinking, is it just all my clients?
No. And it comes back to your question about integration and making sure that we're all working together.
We all do it separate, right? Yeah. Everybody is in their own silo and they don't cross. And I'm shocked at a lot of times that they just don't line up at all.
Well, and often shareholders agreement were done at different times, and so even the reality of when you did your shareholders agreement may be very different than the reality that you had when you did your will. And
so it's so funny because we looked at working with a family, and we were looking at their shareholder agreements and again their wills. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on right now, and the lawyer I brought in, the tax lawyer I brought in, says, okay, so these wills are 30. The shareholder agreement's 30 years old. A lot has changed. You've got nothing to do with this, and this. And they're like, what? We got to get that fixed right now. But when you're younger, you just kind of put the basics in place, right? And I think as we get older, you do want to manage your wealth different, to make sure things work the way you want, to keep your family talking, to keep those conversations open.
Yeah, it's a really good point, because I think one of the questions often is, when do you start all this? You're so busy, You've got so much on the go, and do you start when the kids are young? Do you start when your business is so busy that you don't even have time to really get you
gotta take the 10, 15 minutes, even if it's once a year, just to say, has anything major changed? Because it doesn't matter how old you are. I've had owners of businesses or heads of family die very young, right? And some very old. Yeah. It doesn't mean that they're current. Doesn't matter the age that they pass. A lot of times they're not current. And what they thought was $1 million of insurance was $10,000, because they bought it so long ago. The number's just getting bigger and bigger. Anyway, thank you so much for coming in today, Mehendi. I really appreciate it. And I always like to end my podcast with 3 pieces of advice.
Communication with your family, communication with your professionals is probably one of the hardest things to do on a consistent basis, but it's one of the most important things to do. And so to really understand, when you're thinking about things like, what governance framework do I want to put in place?
Oh, that word.
Ooh, I know, scary word. But what that does allow is to really start to think about, what should my communication cadence be? What do I want to communicate? What do I not want to communicate? And to be upfront about these things. So that'd be one. Number 2, we spent a lot of time in this podcast talking about values. I think being clear on values and making sure that those values are integrated throughout all 3 circles.
I love it. Yeah.
Really, really important.
I don't think people realize how important it is. Sorry to interrupt.
No, you're absolutely right. It is critical. And I'll say the third one is, as you prepare for transitions, as many people often talk about, the NextGen is not ready for a transition. There's a lot of work to help NextGen to become prepared, But one of the critical things that we've seen in our practice is there's two sides to that preparation. It's preparing generation one to also give up a little bit to prepare the next gen and to be also ready for a transition. What does that transition mean for Gen 1 as much as what does it mean for Gen 2 or Gen 3? So maybe those would be my three.
That's amazing. No, I think those are really good. And I love the fact that you brought up values, because when I bring it up, they all look like, oh, we have to go through this, until they start working through it. And it's much more difficult than they think. It's not just throwing a word out. Once they think about it, they go, yeah, that's really not who we are. And it's hard to get people to realize that they have their own values. Then you have the family's values, and there's a compromise, on that to have everybody sort of align, because there are things that you will all agree on as values, but then you also have some of your own values. And I think that's the most difficult part that when I'm working with families, is to get them to go from their individual to a collective family value. And anyway, I just love that. I think that's fabulous. So thank you again for coming in. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
If you like this episode, subscribe